On the subway, Dr. Henry is impressing a lady with his amazing powers of observation. When he's about to get a date, a second train appears on the rails and crashes into his, causing a horrific accident. All the passengers are severely wounded or dead, and Henry is impaled on a metal rod. He tries to reach for his fallen pocket watch, but at that moment he dies. His story started 200 years ago, when Henry worked as a doctor for a slave ship and already had the watch. A black man had a slight fever and Henry was sure he only needed to rest. However, the owners were afraid the man had cholera and wanted to throw him overboard. Henry tried to defend the slave, so the owners shot him and threw his body into the sea. Something happened that night that kept him alive, and now Henry is immortal. Whenever Henry dies, his body appears naked in the water, which is happening now after the train crash. Everyone in the park stares at him and the cops arrest him for exposure. After he's released, he goes to his house in an antique shop and adds the latest incident to his diary, on which he keeps track of every time he dies. Meanwhile, Detective Joe is called to investigate the crash and she finds Henry's watch. The cops search every car and find no survivors. The bodies are sent to the NYC Medical Examiner's office, where Henry works as a pathologist. He is working on opening the train driver when Joe arrives to ask for an update. With his observation skills, he can tell that Joe is a widow and has a drinking problem. Once he finishes the examination, he concludes that the driver was poisoned. At that moment, the phone rings and Henry hears a mysterious man saying he saw him survive the train crash, but the guy hangs up before Henry can ask for his identity. Moments later, Joe checks the station's security cameras and sees Henry getting on the train. The next day, Henry goes to work and finds an anonymous envelope containing a picture of him and his late wife Abigail in 1955. She always believed that Henry was chosen to be immortal for a greater purpose. The envelope also has a newspaper covering the subway disaster and a note, so Henry concludes that the mysterious caller caused the accident to prove he's immortal. Afterward, Henry takes a blood sample from the dead driver and takes it home. His adopted son Abe knows his secret and injects him with the poisoned blood. Henry dies and appears in the river as usual, but now he knows that the poison is aconite. When he tries to return home, he finds Joe and the cops waiting for him. They take him to the station for interrogation and Joe shows him the watch. Henry easily changes the subject and tells them about the aconite. He points out that he can't be the killer because he's telling them about the poison and that they don't have enough evidence to hold him, so he leaves. Later at the lab, Henry examines the body again until he finds the bruise left by the poison injection and a fingerprint. He takes this print to the police station and they discover it belongs to a man named Hans. Joe and Henry go to Hans' house and notice a dead rat on the ground. Seeing it as a clue, Henry searches the backyard and finds a greenhouse full of the aconite plant. Then they check the garage, where they discover a lab and the poison. At that moment, Hans arrives and Joe tries to arrest him, but he throws a glass of poison at her and escapes in his car. The aconite is hurting Joe's hand and trying to get into her bloodstream, so Henry lights it on fire to neutralize it. Soon a police team arrives with more information. Hans' wife died in a subway crash caused by the same driver he poisoned for revenge. This confuses Henry because it means Hans isn't the mysterious caller. A quick search of the lab reveals that 2 gallons of poison are missing and there are traces of ethanol. Seeing some drawings of the Grand Central Station on Hans' notes, Henry concludes he's made the poison water-soluble to cause mass death in the station where his wife died. The team rushes to Grand Central and Henry theorizes that Hans will be on the roof to put the poison in the air conditioning. Unfortunately, Hans sees them first and shoots Joe down. Henry rushes to fight Hans only to get shot in the struggle. After Hans turns around, Henry tackles him and they both fall off the roof, dying when they land on a car. Sometime later, Joe wakes up in the hospital with Henry by her bedside. She remembers seeing him fall, but he convinces her that's impossible and says Hans self-deleted. At that moment, he gets a call from the mysterious man, who says he has the same curse as Henry and is looking for a way to end things for both of them. On his way out, Henry remembers how he met Abigail while fighting in a war and how he rescued Abe as a baby from a concentration camp. One evening, a crying Vicky is in a cab while trying to call someone to no avail. She tells the driver to stop at the bridge and she gets out of the car to self-delete. The body ends up in Henry's morgue and the cops think it was self-done, but Henry is sure it was murder because of the angle of fracture and marks that show she was bracing for the moment of impact. Joe takes this information to her boss Joanna, who doesn't believe it was murder and tells Joe to close the case as self-deletion. However, Henry refuses to sign a report that goes against his medical knowledge. Vicky's parents show up at his office and swear their daughter was a happy person, so she couldn't have done this. Watching them makes Henry think about Abigail and how they raised Abe together. That night, Henry goes to the bridge and climbs over the edge to investigate. He finds marks from Vicky's shoes and fingernails where she struggled. He also discovers a hook and slips, but he holds on just in time to avoid falling. When he climbs back on the bridge, he gets hit by a truck and dies again. The driver tries checking on him, but the body is already gone. The next day, they discover new things under Vicky's nails, paint from under the bridge and skin particles from an attacker she scratched. Henry also discovers a note on his desk from the mysterious man saying he knows Henry died again. He takes the note to Abe, who notices the paper is very old. Thanks to the new evidence, Joe keeps investigating and finds out that Vicky had already checked in for a flight to Paris. She and Henry go to Vicky's college to talk to her professor James, who gives them an alibi without them asking. Because of this and other little clues Henry notices, they conclude Vicky had an affair with him and consider him a suspect. Henry steals a pen to run a DNA test that matches the skin found under Vicky's nails. He and Joe go to see James' wife and she backs up his alibi. However, Henry calls her out for lying and points at different clues around the house that prove she knows about the affair. The wife cracks and confesses James lied. Later at the station, Henry notices that James has a skin condition and realizes Vicky scratched him while they were doing the naughty, so he isn't the murderer. The cops think it's a stretch and arrest James anyway. Meanwhile, Abe has done more research on the letter and discovered the crest on the paper is from a hotel. Henry realizes it comes from a hotel in Italy that doesn't exist anymore. He stayed in that place once when he tried to break up with Abigail because of his condition, but she didn't let him. Later, Henry examines Vicky's body again and finds flesh in her mouth, meaning she bit her attacker. He's interrupted by Joe, who has found James dead in his office. The cops think he self-deleted, but Henry searches the crime scene and with a few clues confirms James was also murdered. While the cops go after the wife, Henry visits a student whose name he saw on James' papers. The guy's hand is bandaged and Henry realizes that's where Vicky bit him. It turns out he helped James and Vicky with the paper they were writing, but they weren't going to add him to the credits, so he killed them for revenge. Using a knife, the student takes Henry hostage, which is seen by the cops on the security cameras. Joe and his colleague immediately surround them and shoot the student in the shoulder to force him to release Henry, finally closing the case. When Henry goes home, he gets another call from his mysterious stalker. The guy knows Henry is 200 and claims to be 2,000 years old. He also says his name is Adam. Sometime later, Henry finishes a whole study on his list of deaths and discovers that different deaths may take longer to be reborn from. Abe gets angry because he hates seeing Henry so desperate to end his curse while he suffers from getting old, so they end up arguing. In the evening, Bill gets his briefcase stolen and decides to chase after the thief. He manages to tackle him and starts beating him up, only to then die of an apparent heart attack. The body makes it to the morgue and Henry is surprised to find that this 67-year-old has an incredible physique for his age. However, his brain had lots of illnesses, as if he had an old brain and a young body. There's a strange liquid in his stomach and no other food or drinks, so he concludes that's what killed him. Joe and Henry talk to Bill's son, who says his dad changed dramatically after his wife died. He forgot his family and focused on physical fitness and partying. Bill was found in Chinatown, but he hated that area, and in his briefcase they found a business card for some kind of healing clinic plus a large sum of cash. The duo next visits Chinatown and follows a series of clues to track down the spot where Bill died. There they see a fancy lady who looks very out of place in this neighborhood. They follow her to a shady door that has the same symbol they saw on the business card. When they go inside, they discover an expensive clinic named Eterna run by Dr. Gardner, who explains Eterna is a supplement that helps people feel young again. However, he refuses to give them a sample without a warrant. Henry notices that Gardner has had plastic surgery to make his nose longer and to feminize his jaw, which are unusual choices and probably mean he's trying to hide his real face. Then he pretends to accidentally bump into a patient to secretly steal her Eterna. Joe asks Gardner for a business card to get his fingerprints. All this business reminds Henry of the 1900s when people sold fake cures for tuberculosis. After running a bunch of tests, Henry discovers that Eterna uses cheap compounds to cut corners. Joe also does research and learns that Gardner is using a fake name. He has no medical training, and he used to run a clinic in which many people died. They go to see Gardner at his house, where he's having a pool party. He explains he doesn't make Eterna, he only sells it, which Henry believes because he doesn't have the training. While Gardner changes into proper clothes to leave with him, Henry meets one of the patients and notices she's having memory problems. Suddenly they hear Gardner scream and run to check on him, only to find him killed by a stab wound. The injury is very exact and made by a scalpel, which means the killer has medical training. Later at the morgue, Henry confirms that Gardner's brain was also being affected by Eterna. The compound is filled with prions from infected tissue, which means the patients are drinking human brains. Joe and Henry confront his coworker Lucas, who confirms 12 bodies have disappeared from the morgue. Lucas shares his routine from the last week to find any holes, and they quickly realize the only person with access to the bodies is the ambulance driver. The cops rush to surround the guy and find him with a body in the ambulance. During interrogation, the driver swears he's making Eterna, but Henry doesn't believe him because he lacks the knowledge and training. When the police find the clinic's list of patients, Henry is shocked to see Abe on it. He rushes home to comfort him, and Abe explains he doesn't want to be young. He just worries how Henry will manage without him. He didn't take Eterna because it was too suspicious, but he met the chemist who made it. He describes the chemist to the police, and a search of her face in the system reveals she's the sister of a morgue employee and Gardner's girlfriend. Later, Abe sees the chemist on the subway and calls Henry to tell him he'll follow her. The cops rush the station and Henry finds her first, so she explains she didn't know Eterna was hurting people. Gardner got it from her after he threatened to send her back to her home country. It wasn't her decision to use cheap ingredients either. That was also Gardner. She's feeling lots of guilt and wants to self-delete, but Henry stops her and closes the case. At a fancy party in a museum, Gloria insults most of the guests. When she walks down a corridor, she notices someone following her. Moments later, the police are examining her dead body. Joe is surprised to see Lucas there instead of Henry. It turns out Henry used to be friends with Gloria, and it hurts him to see her body arrive at his morgue. Since Gloria belonged to one of the most important families and the city reporters are curious about her death, and Lucas accidentally mentions to them that it was a murder. Soon the news appear on every paper, and Gloria's family is furious about this information leak. Henry takes the blame to protect Lucas, and he's pulled off the case. Joe still invites Henry to investigate with her, and they go to the museum, which makes him very uncomfortable because he used to come here with Abigail often. Following a series of clues, Henry retraces Gloria's footsteps. He concludes that she was pushed down the stairs and then tried to crawl away. Checking the security cameras confirms that there was someone with her. The man on the camera is Lance, who is taken to the station for interrogation. He claims he asked Gloria's blessing because he wants to marry her granddaughter, whose father Conrad didn't approve. Lance has Gloria's ring, but he didn't steal it. She gave it to him for the engagement. She told him to follow his heart, which sounds suspicious because usually she doesn't behave sweetly. Gloria had been acting strange, and Henry makes Joe ask Lance about the symptoms, which makes him think she had a stroke. However, he's off the case, so he can't check the body to confirm. He remembers meeting Gloria during the museum party and how she told him to marry Abigail before it was too late. Joe tries to talk to Lance's fiancée and learns how dysfunctional the family is. Gloria is described as heartless, and rumors say she was planning to cut Conrad out of the will. Conrad's currently auctioning off Gloria's furniture, and Abe gets to attend, thanks to owning the antique shop. He sneaks into Gloria's bathroom and takes a photo of all her medication, but none of these could have caused a stroke. Later at the station, Henry sees Conrad yelling at Reese and notices his hand is shaking, meaning he has epilepsy. Henry asks him what medicine he takes and confirms it's the kind of compound that could have killed Gloria. The cops interrogate him, and Conrad confirms that Gloria already cut him out of the will. He has a motive, but the police don't have evidence to keep him in custody. When Henry returns to his lab, Lucas tells him he felt too guilty, so he sneaked into the funeral home and took a sample of Gloria's liver. Henry immediately examines it and confirms that Gloria was poisoned by the medicine, but it was before the party. The only person Gloria was with during that time had been her nurse. At that moment, a cop brings a newspaper announcing that the nurse inherited Gloria's fortune. While the cops interrogate the nurse, Joe and Henry search Gloria's room. Among the ashes in the fireplace, they find a burned letter and a missing champagne glass despite Gloria not being a drinker. Henry calls the station to ask the nurse more questions and realizes the food Gloria ate made the medicine act faster, so it was given to her later. Next, they check Gloria's car and find the medicine that killed her. Henry gathers the family and the cops to share his conclusions. Gloria had been terminally ill and took the medicine to self-delete. However, the food she ate made it act faster than planned, so she dragged herself across the floor to die in front of a painting made by an ex-lover of hers who also sent the burned letter. After the case is closed, Joe shares a story of her dead husband. In return, Henry confesses that the museum made him uncomfortable because that's where he proposed to his dead wife. A few nights later, a fancy woman is leaving a hotel when she's suddenly attacked by the shadows. The next morning, Henry and Lucas are called to the station because the cops received a bleeding box. When Henry opens it, he finds a human heart inside. After studying the heart in his lab, Henry informs the police that it belonged to a woman and was removed while she was still alive. They go through the recent missing women in the system, and Henry discards them using his observation logic until he concludes the victim must have been a night worker. This reminds him of the time he investigated the crimes by Jack the Ripper, since he was the doctor in charge of studying the bodies back then. The group goes to the hotel where the lady often worked, and Henry finds a blind spot where a criminal could drag a body without being seen. Nearby, there's a meat factory, and Henry realizes the victim has the same name as one of the women killed by Jack the Ripper, which means they're dealing with a copycat. By searching the factory, the cops find the dead lady's body, and Henry is impressed by all the exact details that match Jack's old crimes. At that moment, Henry gets a call from Adam, who knows the identity of the body. Henry hears a siren on the phone, but also outside, which means Adam is nearby. He runs outside to try to catch him, but only finds his abandoned phone. Later, Henry takes the phone to Abe, who explains it's a burner and can't be traced. They wonder if Adam is actually Jack the Ripper since he was never caught. He can't share such a theory with the police, so he wants to track the weapon used for the murder. There was a piece of the blade in the body, and Henry recognized it as a very rare surgical blade. Abe gets in contact with another antique dealer who may have had the blade and steals her contact book. Unfortunately, it's in Japanese and he can't read it. Meanwhile, Henry takes a closer look at the body and discovers the killer made a mistake. Instead of cutting the victim's wrist like it really happened, the killer used the shape that the newspapers inaccurately described. This means the killer isn't Jack and has been looking at old news articles. Joe and Henry go to the library and notice that the last person who checked out the old newspaper used another name from the Ripper's case. A second name on the list has the same handwriting and is still in the library. The guy sees them staring and immediately runs away, so the duo starts chasing him. The suspect drops his bag while Joe keeps on following him, but Henry stops to look at it and finds the blade. At that moment, he gets a call from Adam, who is at the crime scene and tells Henry that he missed a detail. It seems the criminal is copying various famous killers and not just Jack. There's a black dahlia at the crime scene and Henry also finds it in the suspect's notebook. Joe catches the guy and takes him to the station for interrogation. He explains he's an author of graphic novels about demons that inspire murderers and it was all research. Some of his fans are very intense and have been stalking him. So this man ran from Joe because he thought she was another crazy fan. Judging by the comments fans leave on his webpage about murder fantasies, he thinks a fan is behind the murders and is using his comics as a guide. Henry and the cops check the comics and confirm the murder could have been copied from them. Soon another body is found at the park and this murder is an exact copy of the famous Black Dahlia case. Inside the victim's mouth there's a piece of nylon, which means the next crime will match the Boston Strangler. There's a leaf near the body that doesn't come from any of the park plants. It only grows in Brooklyn, so the cops search the comic webpage for fans who live in that area. Following the message's IP, the police team bursts into a house and arrests a teenager named Devin. During interrogation, Devin keeps acting very creepy and smug because he thinks they don't have enough to charge him. The parents are yelling at Joanna, who reveals that some shoes in Devin's house match the footprints from the crime scene. Before the parents leave to get a lawyer, Henry tells them he has proof of purchase from an antique shop. Ignoring Joe's scolding about stolen evidence, Henry goes to see the antique dealer anyway and gives her back her book. He tells her about the police investigation and in return the dealer tells him that Devin didn't buy the blade, his father did. When Henry leaves the store, Devin's dad ambushes him and stabs his lungs. Afterward the man enters the store and captures the antique dealer. He starts strangling her but is interrupted by Henry, who is ready to fight even in that condition. After lots of struggle, both men fall down the stairs and Henry is in shock, so the killer steps on his back. Then the man goes upstairs and is blocked by Joe, who shoots him when he tries to get his gun out. In the basement, Henry is found by Adam, who doesn't want their secret to be discovered yet. He kills Henry by slashing his neck to make his body disappear. The next day Joe closes the case while dealing with the fact that she killed a person. Henry gets another call from Adam, who says it's only a matter of time before Henry becomes a murderer too. Sometime later a British Viscount named Colin Cavendish is getting ready to marry an American woman called Emily. However, he isn't comfortable with all the money his father-in-law Norman is wasting on the party. The next day Colin is found dead in the middle of Central Park. Joe finds it weird that a Viscount was walking in the park in the middle of the night and that he was murdered but not robbed. Henry thinks the wounds on the body don't make much sense and remembers there's no Viscount Cavendish, which a cop confirms after calling the British Embassy. It means this guy is an imposter. Later at the lab they discover Colin is blonde but he dyed his hair. This makes Henry remember all the times he painted fake gray hairs on his head to pretend he was getting older. His neighbors would still catch up and he was forced to move to another city with his family. In the present, he finds small gold flakes in Colin's neck wound and some gravel in his other injuries. The curvature of his mouth also indicates he's American. The very specific and extensive stitching of his clothes makes Henry realize they share a tailor. Joe and Henry go to see the tailor, who doesn't have any clues because Colin paid everything in cash. He tells them Colin got a wedding suit and the duo goes to the wedding registry next. While Joe talks to the employee Patricia, Henry notices a bike messenger with the same leg scars as Colin. The man tells him the scarring comes from riding a bike all day long and recognizes Colin from a picture. His real name was Dwight and he used to be a bike messenger too, but he disappeared a year ago. After some research, Joe tells Joanna what she's discovered. Dwight grew up in Oklahoma as an orphan and bounced around many foster homes because he came to New York and worked as a messenger but never made enough money to meet a woman like Emily, who is rich thanks to her father's company. When Emily comes to the police station, they have to tell her the truth about her fiancé's identity. At the lab, Lucas finds a torn-up check in Dwight's pocket. He puts together the pieces to discover it's for $1 million from Norman. Joe and Henry go to see Norman, who is walking with a slight limp that he blames on playing golf. They ask him some questions and Norman accidentally mentions Dwight was from Oklahoma, which the police haven't told anyone. Henry finds some fabric on the wall that belongs to Dwight's suit and concludes that he and Norman had a fight. In fact, Norman's golf club matches one of Dwight's injuries. Norman is taken to the station and his lawyer gives the cops a written statement. It says that Norman did hit Dwight with a golf club at home but didn't stab him later at the park. Apparently Dwight confessed all to Norman and planned to tell Emily too, hoping to run away with her if she'd still have him. Norman also has an alibi for the time of death. Later Henry takes another look at Dwight's body and discovers that the wound from the golf club had been treated. Henry realizes someone must have been helping all along since a rural boy from Oklahoma doesn't have the means to imitate a British lord. Looking at a catalog to find where he bought the expensive clothes, he sees a gold pen and theorizes that's the murder weapon. The cops investigate where Dwight bought everything and learn he was using Patricia's employee discount. The team searches Patricia's apartment and they find lots of how-to etiquette books, a bloodstained cloth, and a photo of Dwight before his transformation. They theorize that Patricia killed Dwight because he fell in love with Emily for real instead of running away with Patricia and the scam money. Checking the security cameras reveals that Patricia was both training and dating Dwight. Patricia hasn't gone to work since the investigation started, and now her face is on wanted signs all over the city. In the afternoon, Henry goes with Abe to the cemetery and they see Emily at Dwight's funeral getting too close to her father's lawyer. Henry also sees Patricia sneaking around, so he and Abe follow her while calling Joe. Patricia is eventually arrested and taken to the police station, where she swears she's innocent. She confirms Dwight broke up with her, and the night of the murder he was going to tell Emily the truth. Hearing about Central Park, Patricia reveals Dwight was killed on the spot where he proposed to Emily. The group goes to the park and does a little reenactment that proves Emily didn't have the strength to kill Dwight, not to mention she has an alibi. Someone must have killed Dwight to keep Emily around, so the cops decide to arrest her to set a trap. In the evening, Norman's lawyer goes to the park to search for the golden pen he buried after the murder to confirm the cops don't have it. The detectives surround him and immediately arrest him. It turns out the lawyer is in love with Emily and killed Dwight to keep her from running away with him. While giving Emily an update on the case, Henry and Joe assure Emily that Dwight truly loved her and tore up the check because he didn't want the money. Afterward, Henry takes a cab home only to discover that the driver is his mysterious stalker Adam. Minutes ago, Adam killed the real taxi driver and stole the car to trick Henry. He starts driving like a maniac through the city while pointing out that Henry doesn't believe he's immortal. To prove it, he uses a gun to self-delete and his body disappears. The vehicle loses control and falls into the river. Henry pushes all the doors and windows but fails to open them, so he ends up drowning. When he comes back to life, some cops see him swimming naked and arrest him. At the station, Joanna demands an explanation, so Henry says he's a sleepwalker. Joanna tells him being eccentric is fine, but this can't go on because it'll challenge his credibility. The other officers tease him for the incident, but Joe shows concern, which Henry ignores. At the lab, Lucas shows Henry the latest body, who happens to be the taxi driver. There's only one wound indicating he was stabbed by a sword. Then Henry tells Abe what's happening and Abe scolds him for going after Adam alone. He wants Henry to ask Joe for help, but Henry remembers the time he trusted another one of his wives with his secret and she sent him to an asylum. Henry takes some swords from the antique shop to do some tests, but none of them match the wound. Soon the cops find the cab in the water and take it out to look for clues. The casing from Adam's shot is under the seat and a detective recognizes it as a bullet from an antique gun. Joe wants to get DNA from the scratches on the back seat, but Henry tells her the water must have washed it off. She also finds Henry's watch, so he pretends he just dropped it. That night, Henry and Abe go to the river to look for the gun. When they finally see it floating in the water, Henry gets ready to jump to retrieve it, but they're interrupted by the police. Henry is taken to the station again and he tells Joanna that he was looking for clues, so he's allowed to leave. Joe checks on him and tells him he may need therapy, but she also offers an ear if he ever needs it. This makes him remember his time at the asylum and all the horrible treatments the doctors put him through. Henry decides to try therapy anyway. After some chatting, the therapist Lewis decides Henry needs more people he trusts and can talk to in times of need, since obviously being a loner has taken a toll on him. Meanwhile, the cops find the gun where Henry saw it last night. It's a very old model and registered in Brooklyn under the name Richard Smythe. They go to the address on the gun license and find the apartment empty except for a dead body. This is Richard, the owner of the apartment, and his body has been opened up. Joe calls Henry, who checks the body and explains this guy was autopsied while still alive. The cuts were done by a very exact blade, like a hunting knife. Getting suspicious, Henry rushes back to his office and checks his tool bag. It turns out his own hunting knife is covered in blood. Then Henry shares this with Abe, who concludes they must either leave the city or trust Joe with the secret. Meanwhile, Joe arrives at the lab and Lucas tells her that Henry has been acting weird. He also reveals that Richard's body was autopsied in Henry's style. Joe goes to the antique store and finds Henry packing to leave the city. She also sees him holding the bloodstained blade. Abe tells him to confess the truth, but Henry keeps thinking about his torture in the asylum. Henry is taken to the police station and he tells Joanna and Joe a modified story, saying he has an insane stalker who thinks he's immortal. Since at the beginning it was only anonymous calls, he thought they were just pranks, but finding the body made him realize it was a real crazy man. Henry was planning to leave town because the thought that would make the stalker stop. Joe points out that Henry was with the therapist at the time of the murder and Joanna believes he's innocent. Afterward, Henry and Lucas do a thorough autopsy of the body and find a bite mark. Both victims were also recently vaccinated for hepatitis B. Joe checks the men's employment history and discovers they worked in the same psychiatric hospital. Henry and Joe visit the hospital and learn that both men left their jobs after a physical altercation with a patient. However, the hospital won't tell the cops which patient did it without a court order, but the files can be seen by a psychiatrist. Henry asks his therapist to help them and Lewis gets his hands on the patient's file. The guy's name is Clark and there are no birth records, but he's been repeatedly caught skinny dipping in the river. He's very violent, has attacked many employees, and has no fear of death or sense of self-preservation. Clark is supposed to be in counseling right now, so Joe rushes to the security guard's office to lock down the building. Unfortunately, Clark sneaks out right before the door is locked. Afterward, Joanna sends a bunch of cops with wanted posters to search the city for Clark. Henry goes home and hears very loud music. Instead of Abe, He finds Clark waiting for him in the basement. Clark kneels as he reveals a katana and asks Henry to end things for him, but Henry refuses. At that moment, Abe arrives home and Clark reaches for the sword to stop him, so Henry tackles Clark and they start fighting on the floor. After lots of struggle and throwing each other against the furniture, Henry manages to grab a knife and stabs Clark, instantly killing him. This means he wasn't Adam. When the cops come to retrieve the body, they tell him he shouldn't feel bad because it was self-defense and he took out a serial killer, so it was a righteous kill. Suddenly the phone rings and Henry gets a call from Adam, who explains Clark was a psychopath, so Henry did a good deed. Adam had manipulated Clark to convince him that Henry could pass his immortality by killing him, and now Henry has finally experienced something new in his long life. When Adam tells Henry to look outside, it's revealed his identity is actually Lewis, who leaves in a cab before Henry can react. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.